I don't know whether this is considered cheating or not, but it has a boiler, it has a firebox, and technically runs on tracks, so I am counting it. Logging in the 1800s was big business in the US. Timber was used for a variety of forms, from housing to furniture, and the land cleared paved the way for new towns and cities and enticed gold prospectors, especially in the California regions. Lumber production was ramped up over 700% in the latter half of the 19th century, that by the year 1900, lumber had become one of the largest industries in the country. Steam and steam engines were integral in helping move the lumber around. The long trains were common and useful, especially in getting wood to the harbour yards to be exported, but getting the lumber on these trains was very difficult, especially if the forests were not close to the line side. Loggers would have to put the trees onto sleds and then have horses pull them to the waiting trains, sometimes for several miles. You might be thinking, why not build tracks to get the trains closer? While most tracks were built with easy removal in mind, in many cases the land simply was not suitable to support a railroad and a heavy train. There were gradients to consider, as well as the clearance of root systems, and in some cases the land was just too boggy or soft. It was simply too much fuss to add a railway for only a few months, only to remove it again when the logging was complete. Despite this, at the turn of the century, something was needed to be done to increase output. In Maine, the loggers had an additional problem: ice. The winters on the logging fields were particularly hard, and the horses had to contend with terrible conditions and impassable roads. Gasoline cars were trialled, but their wheels would get stuck in the snow and ice. Alvin Lombard was born not far from the logging fields in Maine in 1856, and from an early age had been introduced to logging as his parents owned and ran a sawmill. Rather being interested in the lumber, Alvin's passion was the machinery that powered it. At first, his innovations was to the internal working of the sawmill, making it more efficient. However, his attention turned to further afield. He knew that many loggers were still using basic tools and horses to get the wood out of the forests, and the more practical steam-hauled engines had its limitations by being stuck on iron rails. If he could merge the strength of the locomotive with the versatility of the gasoline car, then he knew he was on to a winner. And that's pretty much what he did. In his blacksmith workshop in Waterville, Alvin, along with his brother Samuel, produced a very unique engine. From the running board up, it was the very model of a steam engine, complete with firebox, boiler, regulator, the works. But it was below that the engine differed. The first engines he produced had vertical boilers and were steered by horses, but this was quickly ditched for a more standard engine, complete with saddle tanks, and a steering system that is entirely bonkers, even by today's standards. At the front, under the smoke box, instead of driving or leading wheels, was a set of skis, or in summer, wheels. These skis were controlled by the steerman. The steerman was probably one of the most important, if not the most dangerous position of the four-man crew that needed to control the locomotive. The steerman would stand on the running board in front of the smoke box and use an iron wheel to turn the skis where the crew wanted to go. It was fine on the flat and the uphill. It was on the downhill that the fun started, especially with the ice. Quite often the loads would push the engine down the hill, and the whole thing would hurtle down the hill with only the steerman standing in between them and careening into a tree. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the steerman was forced to jump into a patch of snow for dear life. It also wasn't much fun when the engine was behaving. Standing next to a spark-producing chimney in a red-hot smoke box wasn't anyone's idea of a good day, and it was common for the men to either overheat or their clothes to catch fire. The job, surprisingly, paid rather well, and many steermen were happy to do the work, even have enough money to purchase fireproof clothes. Some of the engines carried hoods protecting the steermen from the smoke and the sparks, but many complained it hindered them if they needed to make a quick exit. The engine would also need a driver and a fireman. As with any steam engine, they were helped to keep the engine going, and the final man was the conductor. Next to the steerman, the conductor's job was nearly just as dangerous. It was his job to manage the load and make it secure, but it wasn't easy, especially if snow or ice was a factor. Behind the steerman, under the running boards, sits the reason why this engine was so good in this terrain: tracked wheel treads. Alvin had the innovative idea: if the engine couldn't leave the tracks, then bring the tracks with them. The driving wheels were encased in a continuous track system. Continuous track systems have been thought of as early as 1825, but the idea never gained any commercial successes and rarely worked. There'd been many prototypes and even engines built, but nothing on the scale Alvin was planning. After much trial and error, he perfected the tracks and was confident he could reproduce these engines on a commercial scale, and he did. The saddle tank engines were a vast improvement on the vertical boilers. Firstly, they had a differential to help vary the speed of the tracks, and the saddle tank helped distribute weight along the body and over the tracks, helping with traction. In all, 83 of these Leviathans were made, making Lombard engines the first ever tracked vehicle to be sold commercially. Production of lumber ramped up massively thanks to this machine. These engines could take several sleds of lumber many miles to the waiting trains and saved many horses' backs. What could have taken days to move with horses with many trips can now be done in mere hours with just one. These engines were not fast at all, unless they were skidding on ice, but they were extremely powerful. In the 1920s, the first real engine to challenge the Lombards started to roll its way into the forests: the bulldozer. These engines, firstly adapted from tractors, were more versatile than the Lombards, as many could produce road-like structures through the logging sites, which lorries could use to get the lumber straight from the source. This also meant that the 4 men on one engine would quickly be reduced to 1. This quickly spelt the end for the Lombards, and after dabbling with gasoline and a diesel engine to try to stay and compete, Lombard threw in the towel in 1934, with the majority of the engines heading for the scrapyard soon after to help with the war effort. Lombard sold his design to the Phoenix Company in Wisconsin, who went on to produce over 60 haulers, so while the Lombards were down, they were not out. Thankfully, out of the 83, 6 steam haulers and several gasoline haulers survived the cutter's torch, and amazingly, 3 steam haulers are even still running. Lombard number 74 was restored to working condition by Harry C. Crocker and is currently on display at the Maine Logging Museum. It is currently assisting its brother Lombard 38 by being a guide for the University of Maine students who are studying it in order to get 38 into running order, which I've just heard has just been completed. Lombard number 70 is also in running condition. It is in the Lincoln, New Hampshire, and is used for public events. Lombard 82 is also not far from its siblings at the Patton Lumberdsman Museum in Maine. It is incredibly well preserved, so well it was designated a Natural Historic Engineering Landmark in 1982. Considering its value as a historical artefact, the likelihood of it running again is practically nil. Lombard 39 is a unique engine, as it was one of the Lombards with a lap seam boiler. It is missing vital elements such as the cab controls and some steam pipes, and was last used in 1936. It calls the Ashland Logging Museum home, and is interesting to see it in an unrestored state. The next Lombard lost its number, so we can't be sure what engine it was. Its condition has been described as rough, and it only really consists of the boiler. This Lombard is situated at a place called Cunliffe Depot and is only accessible by boat. If it wasn't for Alvin, continuous tracks would have been another pipe dream. He proved it was possible and he is justly accredited for it. His machines proved that tracks can work anywhere, even in places where steam locomotives have never dared to go.